Welcome back to Fast Market on the TD Ameritrade Network. I'm Tom White, joined by my co-host Kevin Hinks. But let's bring in our next guest for our cash tag segment, and that's Megan Brantley, the Vice President of Research at LikeFolio. Thanks for joining us, Megan.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, so we're talking discount retailers. It seems like this should be in the news because it seems like the consumer is getting stressed a little bit with rising fuel costs and rising costs for everything. Inflation's abound. I was doing some research on this earlier, Megan. $18,000 general stores. I did not realize that, as most of them are in small towns outside of major cities. What are you seeing as far as data goes ahead of their earnings tomorrow morning?
Yeah, so it's a really good point that you make about Dollar General. I think that there's a stat that there is a Dollar General store within 5 miles of 75% of the U.S. population, which really makes me wonder where is the remaining 25% living that they're not close to a Dollar General. But I think that shows that, especially for a lot of people living in more rural communities, Dollar General may even be their only option. But they definitely have an enormous retail presence. So whenever we break this down, we're bringing to you guys an interesting view of mention volume change for some of these discount retailers, because the mention volume, the amount of tweets that we get for all of these different names, it's really hard to put that on the same axis, because you have some retailers that obviously have a much larger presence and much larger overall volume. But we wanted to look at, okay, how does that growth look like? And what you can see is that overall, I think that if you look at, let's say, Five Below, Dollar General, and Dollar Tree, which all three have, slightly different models, but do operate in that discount retail space, we see, Five outperforming, we see Dollar Tree underperforming, and we see Dollar General in the middle. So we have Dollar General it's doing better than Dollar Tree, but it's not doing as well as Five Below when it comes to overall growth. So I think that that's something to keep in mind. Really heading into earnings, our data looks a little bit neutral for Dollar General. And I think that that's surprising, considering the environment that we're in, where, we do see a lot of mentions of consumers who are starting to look for those deals, who are starting to maybe be a little bit more frugal or be a little bit more mindful about the purchases that they're completing. And so that's that change in total mention that I mentioned. And this is an interesting view, because what this allows us to do is really, showcase and plot that growth of consumers who are talking about these brands, and kind of remove the element of volume from the conversation. So you can see Dollar General there, positive, doing better than Dollar Tree, but not necessarily as well as Five Below.
Megan, when you look at these names, and Five Below has clearly done something pretty special, this whole treasure hunt idea of shopping, are you guys I'm really fascinated with this kind of a spin-off or a roll-off of Dollar General, and that is this pop shelf stores. Are you guys hearing anything about them? They're more in the same idea of Five Below. They started with 2 in Nashville. They're up to 53 of them in 6 states. I wonder if that's going to be the next catalyst for a company like this, because it seems to be growing. I wonder if that's part of what's keeping Dollar General growing. And you guys are right. You don't realize the massive size of this company until you look at the number of stores. And you know what would be a fun game? Let's try to figure out where there isn't a Dollar General. Miami Beach. I wonder if there's one in Miami Beach, right? Alaska. What part of Alaska doesn't have a Dollar General? It'd kind of be a fun drinking game to figure out where there's no Dollar Generals. But mainly, I'm interested in this Pop Shelf, this new company. I'd like to know if you guys have seen or heard anything about that, Megan.
Yeah, so, that's an interesting offering that they have. Like you mentioned, it's a lot of products, kind of diverse offerings. They have arts and crafts. They have a lot more of these like novelty or higher quality items that you might associate with something like a Five Below. And I think that, we are starting to see a little bit of a happiness shift. Whenever you look at the overall happiness mentions of Dollar General versus a Dollar Tree, for example, we have Dollar General at about 62% positive, and we have Dollar Tree at about 57% positive just over the last month. And that has grown. If you look at it over the last quarter, typically the two are usually close to in line with Dollar General, maybe a point or two higher. So you are starting to see Dollar General sentiment improve, which I think is, one positive thing that we could take from this. But the company still lags well behind Five Below. I think Five Below sentiment is around 75% positive. So whenever you're, listening to the consumer, the quality of the products and the quality of the store experience with Five Below is perceived higher. But Dollar General is starting to make improvements, and I think that those pop shelf offerings, that's part of it. Another offering that Dollar General is doing well in is their grocery. When we look at specifically mentions of consumers who are talking about going to Dollar General to buy a grocery item, those are up by about 18% year over year. And so that's an element where, I don't necessarily know that a consumer would go to Five Below to get groceries, or, maybe you can get some things at Dollar Tree, but definitely not the, the fresh produce or the essentials that you might be looking for. So, that's another, could add that into the positive column for Dollar General of one thing that they are doing well, and that's helping to kind of separate themselves in this environment.
Yeah, and I noticed the one chart that you had about inflation fear up 30-day moving average year over year, up 387%. Now, this seems like it would fit right into a discount retailer's wheelhouse. But if you look at the stock on your first chart here, Megan, about consumer mentions for them, it seems like the stock price is still outperforming the data that you guys are reflecting in Dollar General moving forward.
Yeah, so, for us, this is one of those things where we would expect the environment that Dollar General is operating in, we'd expect to see, an uptick in demand or a more serious uptick in demand, and it's pretty flat. I think that one way to look at this demand mentions is this is kind of like that growth, and it's just stagnating a little bit. Now, I think, you could play devil's advocate and say, okay, how many of these rural Dollar General users are tweeting about it on social media? And maybe that's lower, but this should be a, pretty good representative sample because you're comparing that growth against itself. So you're comparing Dollar General's core audience against itself, and we're starting to just see some stagnation. So I think that that's something to be aware of, and that's part of the reason why, even though we're seeing some improvements in happiness, we're seeing that just like flat growth rate for Dollar General. So for us, from an earnings score perspective, we really don't feel like we have much of an edge going into this event. I think our score, when we calculated it out, is a -1. So I think that's about as close to neutral as we could be for a company, at least heading into earnings. In contrast, if we were talking about Dollar Tree or if we were talking about Five Below, those scores are much more polarizing. Obviously, Five Below to the upside and Dollar Tree to the downside. So, I think that there are other plays that you could look at here whenever you're, if you're trying to pick a direction or trying to find an edge. But at least for Dollar General's earnings event specifically, we're pretty neutral.
Yeah, and the stock's been kind of gyrating here. It's only down about $35 from its all-time highs, but has been consolidating, doing better than a lot of the retailers that we've seen lately also. All right, great stuff as always, Megan. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys. You too.
All right, that's Megan Brantley, the Vice President of Research at LikeFolio.